that just disclaimer in mind as to why it might not actually be necessary to persuade anyone about things in order to have an impact, this presentation is about persuasion. And it'll be in two basic parts. I kind of think of it one as speaking. Part one's about speaking, part two is about listening. And you'll go into more detail about what all that means. I have some slides here. I'm not really worried about putting them on the projector because it's just all text, really just notes for myself to not forget things. So quick introduction, as we did some of this at the beginning. So I'm the onboarding team lead at PauseAI. My main role there is to sell new people on the organization and often on activism generally to convince them to convert their anxiety about AI into actually volunteering their time towards activism. What that looks like is a subject in itself. I also run a debate practice group where we role play outreach conversations where one person advocates for PauseAI or AI being dangerous, and then the other person imagines themselves as an audience, often someone who's skeptical or new to the subject or something like that. And if there's time, we might have a little practice session here with one of you who wants to convey your idea, and then someone else role plays someone they might be talking to, if that's of interest and there's time for it. This particular talk is a mix of a bunch of informal experiences and a bunch of theory I've picked up over the years from various books and classes and other things, ranging from theater to classroom teaching to video game marketing and a bunch of other stuff. So very intuitive and high level. And all of that to say is don't treat any of this as authoritative. Just kind of listen to what makes sense and feels useful for yourself. If something sounds like nonsense or not applicable, then just ignore those parts. But one thing I want to have a little chance as a little temperature check for those of you in the room is what are your reactions, either thoughts or just visceral feelings, to the concept of selling your ideas? What comes up with that idea in mind?
You mean selling metaphorically or literally?
Metaphorically. So the idea of like you have something in mind, and as opposed to just putting it out there, making the best case you can, trying to actually get other people to buy into it.
That's always the smartest move to do. I mean, if nobody reads it and you're not actually trying to turn it in a way so that people might find it, read it, make it easy for them, and well, I mean, stay in your cave.
That's an argument for it being important, but I'm actually going back a little bit. It's just like what comes up on a felt sense, just viscerally.
So as an engineer, a lot of people think that I just work with code and I work with numbers and I'm like sitting behind a desk all day. But anyone who's actually done engineering knows that you're working with clients and you're working with your boss and you're working with potential clients. And it's actually a lot of selling things to management, selling things to your customers, etc. And kind of taking all that into account when you do your engineering process. So my reaction is actually, that is a part that I really like about the job. I think I might differ from a lot of engineers in saying, I actually like having to sell my ideas. I think that is just another challenge in engineering. And in fact, I'd argue that compared to code, it's a much more significant challenge. So that's just my reaction.
Okay, so it is familiar even as an engineer, and there's like a feeling of excitement that actually comes from it.
Yeah, I love going to conferences and actually like kind of having like my company gives me a goal and say like, hey, you need to figure this out and get people in line. I actually like it.
I know it's like a kind of worry I had when you mentioned like advocacy, PauseAI, like, oh, this feels like they're kind of trying to game, other people out there to like, like how do we get them persuaded? Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of a bit of a yucky response there, where it feels like it's kind of exploiting or something, like by itself, because like at the same time I like at this notion, but like, yeah, this feels like it's actually important. Like I think that there's a lot of good ground reasons to try and pause AI development. But like there's that kind of tension I'm noticing there, where like the process itself, to me, while it seems like it's useful, and like it can also maybe kind of help me clarify in terms of like how are people thinking, the way it seems to be optimized was okay. Let's just kind of get to them. Feels like somehow like it feels a bit yucky, or it feels like yeah.
So there's a bit of an ick response, and two things I'm hearing from that. Like, one is a concern about manipulating people, and then a second one I'm also hearing is like a little bit of a transactional mindset of trying to get something from human beings, which goes against human interaction.
In a way where like it feels like it's not it's not encouraging, supporting goodness or truth in a bigger sense. Like if I'm going to be really idealistic about this, yeah.
So a concern that there's like it might go up against truth seeking as well.
And or like some sense of kind of good, like we're not just kind of pushing our own agenda here, but we're doing this in some kind of mindfulness or some sense of like considering like what other people are caring about in the moment and over larger time as well.
Yeah. I really recognize that I like selling ideas. I'm good at it. I do that very well. I'm great at making people enthusiastic. And then I have a little part of my brain going, yeah, but what about truth seeking? What about truth tracking here? I remember being at the think tank I started and realized, oh, in the time I can write 10 pages think tank report, it takes me, I can write 1 page proper academic paper that is actually kind of tracking stuff that I think is the best epistemic thing. Now, there is this issue here about the utility, and I think I'm kind of fine with the spreading ideas I think are true and important, but I think there is a seduction going on, and it might even be that you seduce yourself into selling your idea. I certainly have seen other people in the think tank world who, after being paid to spread certain ideas, start to actually believe in these ideas, not just promulgate them. And some of these ideas are really stupid. They already know totally better. It's kind of horrifying when you meet somebody who once upon a time was a sensible person, and now it's a climate denier and skeptical about vaccines, because that was where the think tank money was coming in from. But it's kind of,
There's a certain worry about like taking on a kind of corruption, essentially, of like if you're saying something and maybe it isn't fully true, eventually you'll start believing it. Or if it wouldn't necessarily have to go all the way towards climate denial. Maybe there's some subtle ways where what you're trying to push isn't exactly what you want, but then it becomes more aligned.
hard to get out of it. One interesting thing I got as critique in my family is that I'm very good at debating. I'm willing to debate way more, of course, than the normal Swedes are, and I tend to do that a little bit too much. And it's very fun when my friends can point out, Anders, now you did it again. You reformulated the terms of this debate onto your home turf, so you would be guaranteed winning. I realized, yeah, I did that without thinking. And that, without thinking, I think is the scary part. Not that I was kind of overusing it.
I want to go off of that. Something that I've noticed is, and this gets down into manipulation, and it's been said that psychopaths manipulate people without even knowing it. And the more you try to sell somebody, and the more you try to persuade somebody to do something and impose, in many ways, your will upon that person, the more it becomes habitual. And then the more it becomes instinctive. And I'm very conscientious-ish about that. And it does actually give me some pause for concern when you realize you were talking to a client and you just did that naturally. You feel like you're corrupting part of your soul.
I want to hear the same gut reaction from all the people that have not yet spoken on this topic specifically.
I guess we could just go around then. Yeah. I guess I feel a similar kind of reluctance, maybe more than I should, about selling my ideas, just because I don't know, I'm not sure if it's like me trying to rationalize that reluctance after the fact versus like this is how I actually feel. But I guess one rationalization that comes to mind is that by selling my own ideas, maybe I oversell them to the point that other ideas that are perhaps more effective or accurate, I guess you could say, just better ideas, they get crowded out or they get overshadowed by my effort to sell my ideas.
Okay, so there might be something else that's more accurate that you're crowding out.
Like truth-seeking ideas.
Yeah, truth-seeking. Also, another thing I heard a moment ago is it's not just that you might internalize some belief that's not totally true, but you might internalize some process that isn't totally ethical. Even if you're saying something that is true, you're using means that you don't like and possibly habituating them so that they become automatic and just part of yourself rather than a tactic you're taking on?
I usually don't do cold sales. So someone invites me to speak at a workshop or do an interview, or people who follow me get a post, but I never like randomly approach crowds and preach to them. So
talking to someone on a podcast, this kind of counts. So do you have any like sense of like you're trying to convince someone in like a conversation? Like this is in the category.
So I do lots of that. I probably spend, 30-40% of my time talking about research I did. So that's a big portion of where time actually goes.
Yeah, I might have a different point of view of what selling idea means to me. For me, it's more about red teaming my ideas. I just talk about them to other people, see if it works, if it doesn't work, if they have some better ideas that emerge from that. So for me, it's not that much about pushing my ideas and forcing them. It's about see if there is something that resonates. So I don't have like bad point of view or bad opinion about that. But yeah, if the goal was actually forcing ideas that I don't believe in, or just forcing ideas in general, I would feel uncomfortable with that.
That's actually a good point. There's different meanings as to what actually selling one's ideas looks like, and some of them don't feel as bad as others.
I think if what I have on that is that there's something kind of more subtle there where you can maybe not end up selling particularly your specific opinion on it, but you can still actually kind of attract conversation to go to that particular topic that you're specialized in. So even if it's not that you're getting people to be convinced about your conclusion, like you're kind of drawing everyone's attention to this particular area or way of thinking about this that still kind of like causes a lot of attention to go to work that you're supporting, or like it's depend on you. Sorry, I'm just kind of saying this also in general. Like, how do you think about that? Because like that gets a little bit more subtle and like kind of maybe even subconscious.
Yeah, you might draw the attention to the thing you're interested about. For me, that's perfectly valid. I don't see another way to test my ideas than to actually do that. So I don't feel that I'm responsible for the whole world in general. So I don't feel that I have myself to make sure that all the possible ideas are equally explored. I try to do it a bit, but I think it would be kind of overestimating my impact on the world than to actually try to do it full time.
Cool. I close the discussion here, just kind of give a chance for anyone who hasn't spoken yet, if they want to say a reaction. Also feel free to pass.
First, do you want to say?
Yeah, I think in my case, to echo a little bit, I think there can be perhaps a felt sense of anxiety sometimes with selling ideas that I might not be confident about, and the anxiety is partly like about reaching like a kind of, is it true enough, essentially like a confidence about the idea itself. On the other end, I think I feel awkward with the framing, or maybe as you're saying, there's different meanings to selling your ideas, and like if I think of a successful idea, it might not come from it's my idea and I'm selling it, more so like the idea makes sense to the recipient, and so it seems like I feel challenged in being able to structure the idea such that the other is, or it can also be seen as an act of compassion, in the sense of like, am I understanding the other such that this message can be understood? So if I think of many things that are countercultural now, they might not click with, the most people, maybe because they're not constructed in a way that is received properly. yeah, so it's a feeling of like, oh wow, it's actually really challenging to structure the idea such that it works.
There's a kind of anxiety that what if I fail to really convey this thing correctly in a way that lands?
Oh, how can we speak to the person such that they understand?
Right.
Yeah.
The others?
Yeah, for me, like the framing, when you shared it, like I thought about marketing and rhetoric, which I have like a general aversion to. But because it's more general notion, I was thinking about kind of this. What I actually feel really good about doing is sharing what I care about, like sharing my values, value discovery. In general, I like to kind of like harmonious combination of my thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And so, you know, when it comes to sharing what I care about, I feel like I'm very alive and very excited. And so for me, you know, that feels like a sound space to be, and I'm totally free to engage in care and, you know, use my thoughts to kind of like convey that.
So varies between ick and passion depending on how it's actually being done. And I think there's some nuances there as to what makes those two scenarios different that we'll be touching on later. So I like that people are bringing this up already. So I'm going to take a moment saying like why I brought all this up. You know, part of it is engagement and getting everyone's perspective on this. But the reason I was like focused on the visceral like reaction is because those influence how we think, just as a thing. And there's two generally not very helpful ways of dealing with emotions, in my opinion. One is to treat them as this direct pipeline to truth that has to be acted on exactly as your impulse says. And the other is to go the opposite route and treat it as this just inconvenient, irrational thing that needs to be totally suppressed and ignored so that just the rational mind can make the choices. And there's a third way, which is, this one's a little harder to articulate, but my best sense of it currently is to essentially treat emotions as like compressed information, like warning lights, for example. So anger means someone may have stepped on me or stepped on my autonomy in some way, and I should be aware of a need to protect myself. It won't necessarily always be true to the situation, but is a heightened probability compared to just general. And so it's worth spending your attention to look at that particular category of thing. And in terms of reactions that I've felt myself that I think are fairly common, one is indignation of what I'm saying should just carry itself by its own logic and not have to deal with like any additional interpersonal things. Another feeling that comes up is anxiety. What if I fail? Maybe I'm not very good at this. This isn't really my thing. And then also disgust. There's a phrase on Less Wrong of politics is the mind killer. That if you engage in political or anything else, that'll corrupt your own mind and you'll become part of the problem or anything else. So just taking a moment to call attention to those. So speaking of selling ideas, I'm going to give a little introduction to sales as a concept. And basically the core paradox of how I would describe like how sales works is that you enter into an interaction because of what you want. That's like why you show up in the first place, with the expansive definition of what you want. But it's only successful to the extent that you make it about what the other person wants. And there are different ways of going about it, which has been hinted at in some of the answers, is that it can have this adversarial zero-sum relationship, which can have a very manipulative sort of feel. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could also be collaborative and win-win, depending on how you go about it. So some characteristics that make this distinction, the essential idea in an adversarial interaction is that it starts with the assumption that the other person wants something different from me. And I'm trying to apply some kind of pressure to get them to change or act against their values. Maybe they happen to be exactly aligned and then I'm really lucky, but it's never perfect. So there's always some pulling involved. Whereas a collaborative approach, the essential idea is you figure out what it is that you have, like what value your idea has or the thing you're selling or whatever else. And then you learn as much as you can about the other person and what their interests are. And then you look for the areas of overlap. One consequence of this distinction is in the adversarial approach, there can be a tendency to preserve and exploit informational asymmetries. Simple example of this, which might not be super relevant here, is like price, for example. If you tell someone in a negotiation like the most that you're willing to pay, that's usually a really bad idea because then they can charge you just a tiny bit less than that, which would have been less like greater than if you'd like negotiated otherwise. Whereas in a collaborative sense, there's actually a motivation to share as much information as possible because the more information that's on the table, the more potential overlap there is and the more optionality you have to interact. And then one other driving concept between these is that there's a certain issue of over-optimization that seems relevant here. So this is particularly relevant to persuasion. Most of the low-hanging fruit in convincing someone of something is just removing the friction in conversation. And that's good. Just kind of an unambiguously good thing. However, once you get past a certain point, continuing to optimize can start to bring in more complex things that start to get into manipulation and like weird psychological hacks and so on. So one thing that I would kind of advocate here, if you want to stay in the collaborative mindset, which I think is like really good, is to just be kind of relaxed. Don't try a little bit, but not too hard. You don't have to over-optimize. Okay, so first concept that's getting a little bit more tangible on the speaking side, effectively, is something called the rhetorical triangle. It's just a simple image of a triangle with ethos, logos, and pathos. The position on the triangle doesn't mean anything. So ethos is essentially credibility, trustworthiness. Logos is logic, reason, evidence, all the things that we think of as being part of an argument. And then pathos is emotional impact and personal connection. So ethos deals with the essential question of why should I listen to you? And it's very important because it's the first thing that people engage with. If the ethos isn't present and someone's pressed for time, they're just not going to see the rest, even if it's great. And it doesn't stop there, because most communication involves some degree of trust. People are not necessarily going to track down every single citation that you make. They're not going to follow every single step in your logic or verify that your mathematical proof makes sense. There's extent that people are just going to follow along with it and say like, okay, and to one degree or more. And whether they're willing to do that from a place of trust or skepticism depends on how they perceive you. Now, where you get ethos, it varies a lot. This can come from formal credentials, fitting cultural expectations on tone and style that the community you're speaking to associates with authority, and then also just your personal history of interactions with people. So there's lots of sources for this. Logos deals with the question of, does this make sense? And I'm not going to go into it much because that's basically what everything else in all these other presentations we're talking about, and I'm also imagine most of the people here are better at it than I am. Then pathos deals with the question of why should I care about this? And the thing, I'll go into this more, but the basic concept here is it's explain why your ideas matter with respect to what the audience already cares about. Now, the value of having this rhetorical triangle as a mental tool is that it allows you to break things down and troubleshoot potential areas of disconnect, at least on a broad level. So if you make some argument and you notice that you're being just ignored or dismissed without any meaningful engagement at all, that is evidence, not conclusive, but evidence that there may be some lacking ethos there from the perception of the audience. Whereas if you're just getting really solid counter arguments, then that could indicate that there's an issue with logos, maybe the actual argument needs to be worked on. Or they could also be wrong, but this is just kind of where it's pointing. And then lastly, if people are just getting bored or nodding along and saying, oh yeah, that makes sense, and then they go on and just totally forget everything that you said, this points to a lack of pathos, or that's where you'd get the most bang for your buck in improving. My next slide is based on an image. I'm going to skip this, but basically there's a talk by Rob Miles called Research Communication is Important, so Do Better. Highly recommend that. One concept that he brings up that I'm just going to repeat is basically the importance of summarization. So if you imagine like an image loader, rather than going from the top and slowly building towards the bottom, you start with a really low resolution and then gradually build up the resolution. And the value of this is, like, say you're just going from the top, someone could get the wrong idea of what your image is about, image being a metaphor for like writing, and then either ignore it or get really interested in that, get disappointed when they see what it's really about later. Whereas if you start with the low resolution version, then the audience is able to self-select whether they engage further. Which is a benefit. And if you can have multiple levels of resolution, that's even better, because then people want to engage in different degrees. And so that adds for more accessibility, but it's a lot of work. So just to be aware that that's a value that can be created. So next concept of speaking that specifically relates to pathos is storytelling. Now, this can seem a little weird if you're working on academic research projects. How do I work storytelling into a mathematical proof or logic? And one way I could think about this is to abstract the idea of what is a story. We think about it as like hero's journey or protagonist or all these kind of things. But if you look at it on a atomic sort of level, you can think of every story molecule as follows want, but, so, therefore. A character wants something, but there's some obstacle that they run into, and so they employ some strategy, whether it's cleverness or strength or whatever else, to get their want or circumvent the obstacle. And therefore, something changes. They learn something, they benefit their community, whatever else.
By the way, I'm noticing that's interesting with the whole kind of alignment or limits to control story, because I'm noticing I want, at least where our audience stuff that comes from, I want to align AI, but it seems like there's all these problems and it doesn't seem possible. And I looked into it more. Yeah, it doesn't turn out possible. Conclusion, tragedy. Right. That's kind of like how it feels like the natural progression in terms of the story.
I think more as I want to align AI, but it turns out to be impossible. So I try to convince people not to build AI. Therefore, we're in this conversation about how to help people to see that it might not be a great idea to build autonomous robots.
Exactly. Yeah, these are both very good framings of this concept in a way that feels like a story, which then makes it more memorable and follows this pattern that people can connect with. Then you can also notice that sometimes stories can get more complex by adding lots of levels or degrees of it. So you just added that therefore, and so we start talking to people, explaining them that control isn't really a good thing to go after. Well, then that runs into a but. It's so profitable, or whatever else, and then there's a so, and then therefore, and you also notice in movies and novels that we typically associate with stories, part of what makes them complex and interesting is that there's all these different arcs. Like you have the full story, but then there's each scene has its own want, but, so, therefore. And then you also have multiple characters interacting with each other whose wants push in different directions and they butt up against each other. And so then they're having all these kind of social maneuvers to deal with each other, and and results from that. Now, a research paper doesn't have to be so nested. It can be something like what Remold and Forrest just described of a single story molecule, and that's really all you need. You'll also notice that the typical structure of a research paper sort of follows this on an implicit level, or you could stretch it. So the introduction is often a want, but. The process and results kind of maps to so, and then your discussion and conclusions are kind of the therefore. But yeah, so just something to be aware of that you can play into. Another form of storytelling that isn't universally applicable is sharing your personal journey with your subject. Now, this doesn't apply to research papers most likely, but it could apply to like an interview or blog post or other kind of informal settings. So this would be asking questions like, what initially motivated your current line of research? And the value of this, and it can seem a little weird that's kind of taught you and you want to convey your ideas, but now you're talking about yourself and that's not really relevant. Basically, the idea here is that our beliefs come from somewhere, and they're largely shaped by intuitions. That's like a whole result of experience. And then we refine that later with a specific argument, but really like the why you came to that position and not someone else coming to the same idea is that like there was a personal story that kind of pointed you to be attentive to the things that you then wrote about. And so by sharing that, you allow someone else to follow the same journey that you did and come to that same belief in a more natural fashion. Let's see. I think we kind of already did a little bit of an example of people trying to tell stories about the research. If anyone else wants to take a stab at like something that you've been idea that you want to convey and trying to put it into story form.
I'm not sure, like I don't want to talk too much, but like something I've noticed, Roman, you, and actually, Forrest and I, years ago we had a chat. Oh, I'll point it to you. I can't put it to myself. And you mentioned at the time that you talk with people about your papers, and they kind of just nodded their head, and then they just didn't actually kind of come up with any kind of good counter arguments, or kind of didn't seem to like take a lot of interest. They kind of just went on with whatever they were doing. And like for me, this is like at least a pattern I've noticed in talking about this work, about your work, about Forrest's work, other people's work, is like, I want to be careful to not be arrogant about it, but often there's been a lack of good counter arguments. There's been some times that people like kind of gave an counter argument, like, oh yeah, I need to think about that. I didn't actually properly think that through or address it, which was helpful. But like often, like many times I didn't feel like they were actually more kind of like they were kind of productive or constructive, and it more felt like I just kept bouncing up against the same counter arguments, and almost like I could just, in my mind, I could just like have like some kind of frequently asked question list, or like frequently asked kind of quick, intuitive, kind of reactive kind of counter argument responses that didn't actually take into account the full argument. And it's like, okay, yeah, that one, okay, like let me go down that one, respond to that one, and then they would kind of come up with something that I also kind of heard before, and I wouldn't go down that one. And like at some point, like they got tired of the conversation and it ended, which is quite frustrating for me. So like this is kind of something I've noticed, and it feels like something that other people have also run up against. Maybe other people don't feel like they've run up against it. I'd also be interested in that. But like I've noticed that there's a lot of that kind of like, it didn't feel as much like that there was a problem with the logic, rather than just like a problem with like somehow people just not being that interested. And this feels like a thing that might be worth raising in this conversation.
This is why I have to do all the conversation.
Which of course I do awesomely, which is why all these people just go, no, like I don't like that. I've struggled with this by myself. Like I feel like I haven't done as well.
We do our surveys with all the arguments, AI risk denialism arguments, and we try to address them. We try to automate this process so it's not repeated over and over. How many of you read the paper? Nobody engages with it.
Yeah.
Well, I basically was glad you wrote it, because it gave more than one person basically.
Yeah.
So at this point, like when I found out that you wrote the books yesterday, and I started looking at it, I was like, great, this is relief, because it means that there's at least now more of us talking about this. So that there's less of a chance of plausible deniability. Well, this is just one harebrained wildcat floating off in the wild. We can ignore him. He's probably some sort of aberration. But now there's three of us. And then there's whatever Andrew's group produces, whatever your work produces, and now we're starting to have a lot of people starting to think a little bit more about it, because we're all talking about it.
Sounds a little bit like the Chicken Little problem as well. Like there's an emotional component that, like, maybe the logic is sound, but the emotions that the logic invoke, that people aren't willing or ready to deal with in the moment, so they just kind of shut down.
And to be fair, like I feel like how I managed this in the beginning was not constructive, like in terms of kind of like interpersonal, kind of considering the other person's perspective. I was basically like, hey, I felt like I've kind of digging into this. This seems like it's really a thing. Like, are you like willing to talk about this thing that I want to talk with you about right now? Like basically just kind of barging in, and then it's like, okay, and like let's go through these steps. And then like every time they came up with counter, I was like, no, wait, you don't understand this. And like I felt like in part I was not quite open myself. and I was like, it was that sense of like me kind of pushing them through or kind of constraining them in terms of, so like there was something about that didn't feel quite right. And I do feel like over time there's been ways I've been able to kind of connect more with like what people's current concerns are, and kind of thinking more about like where they are they interested in talk, but not feeling as desperate to kind of, because I was like one of the only people like who seemed like they think about it like desperate to get someone looped in. It was like, okay, who might be interested, and kind of like connect with their interests. So there's ways that around that I felt became more flexible there, but still like I still noticed that this is a thing. Like there's this, it's hard to find people and kind of talk with them in a way to consider something that feels quite significant as something to think
Back
about.
in the model, I want to talk about this thing, but the other people are emotionally triggered, and so they try to move out of the situation. Therefore, I need to find better ways to talk to people so that they don't get as emotionally triggered, and that's been kind of an exercise, really.
Well,
Yeah.
There's one more component too, which I think actually, I don't know you well enough, Roman, but you carry a certain,
Gravitas.
like no, it's a playful nonchalantness that I actually really respect, because like you're obviously someone who bears the weight of the knowledge of the danger that we're in to its fullest. Like no matter how many times you hit your wall against the head, it's clear to you that we're like in a very dire situation. And I think the notion here that's important to incorporate is that human beings aren't machines. And so instead of like, I'm going to push the button, I'm going to get this reaction, I'm going to say this thing, and then, like purely logical inference, like I say A, I'm going to get A back, is maybe not the appropriate thing, as much as like, in an organic sense, you're farming a little bit. Like you're planting seeds with the hope that they'll grow. And so I get this sense from you, the way that you carry yourself, is that you're gonna continue to plant these seeds because you know it's the seeds that need to be planted, but you're not so attached. I mean, you're not going to stop planting the seeds, but you're also not like expecting them to sprout instantly. Or maybe you are, I don't know.
No, you're right. And I have this idea of paper overhang, where like if I keep publishing, one day I'll actually have a viral paper, and people will go, oh, he also has 200 other awesome papers. But more of a personal story, I guess you suggest we sell that. During interviews, people ask me like, how are you not depressed? You're talking about, we got 2 years left, it's going to be terrible for everyone. And I'm like, I see a lot of humor in it. I just published a paper where I map AI accidents on the space of jokes and explain all of it as like, what's the funniest joke possible? It's the worst bug possible. And we need debuggers as out humor detectors. So comedians and debuggers accomplish the same thing in society. They find problems with the world model and report it to others and spread it through reward of humor. So I'm having a great time with this.
Yeah.
Should be that pressure on humor. That sounds like navigating a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you do.
It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter. It's like, aren't you following? I don't understand.
I'm gonna continue on, but yeah, that's appreciate the discussion. Actually, some of the things Rommel was saying segues really well into what I was going to go about next, and I also really appreciate bringing up humor. I wish I had a slide on that, but so failing that, Roman bringing that up is great. If you see any of Roman's podcasts or appearances on video, the ethos is fantastic. So you could totally take notes on that. So anyway, moving on from the speaking part of like treating yourself as like trying to convey the arguments as well as you can to the dynamics of interpersonal interaction, moving on to talking about conversation. And a starting point there is like, what is a conversation? And my favorite definition is from the game designer Chris Crawford, which is that a conversation is an interaction where participants alternately listen, think, and speak. That is, you listen, take information in, you cogitate on it, mix it, the incoming stuff with your own experiences and your own beliefs, and then you say something that is relevant to what you heard and also what you thought about, and then the other person does the same three-step process. Now, you notice here that there's 2 people, 3 steps, that's 6 points of failure. And if any one of those has a problem, the conversation is going to fall flat. which is why really deep, satisfying conversations don't happen very often, because like there's a lot going on. When they happen, they are really powerful. And one other thing I'll put forward here in breaking it down in this way is that there's a tendency, at least I noticed anyway, whenever we see like a conversation breaking down, to accuse the other person of not thinking very well. And this is, to be fair, often probably true. But I would say a bigger problem that's more common is people not listening. Maybe they were thinking just fine, but they just did not take into account anything that you said. And what they said made perfect sense in the context of the things that they were thinking about, but just not in the context of the conversation that you're in. And that's what can actually be a lot more frustrating. So I'm saying that to try, kind of like shift the diagnosis a little bit, because it can have different implications. Then it also raises the question of, well, if listening is really important, if listening is something you want from other people, then that's a pretty strong argument to making sure that you're listening yourself and that you're not committing the mistake that it's really painful when other people do that. So one weird trick for listening well that I like a lot is repeating what the other person says before replying to them. Usually in a summarized, paraphrased, your own words kind of thing. And there's a lot of stuff that happens when you do this. Obviously, it doesn't always apply. It can just sound weird sometimes. But one thing is that it forces you to listen. If you know you're kind of being quizzed on it, in a self-applied sort of way, then you can't really get away with not listening because like, oh, I'm gonna repeat this back. I'm gonna be tested. It also verifies you haven't missed anything. If your summary is wrong, the other person's the arbiter of that. Like if they say you didn't hear me right, they're right. And so they'll correct you, and then you can course correct, and that's useful. A third one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is that it stalls for time, because you weren't thinking of a rebuttal while they were talking, I hope, and but that rebuttals take a little bit of effort and time to think of. So while you're stating things back and listening to them verify it, that is a time you can kind of get away with thinking ahead of what you're going to say next without it being causing problems. The most important thing, though, is that by communicating understanding, that verifies it for them, and so they're able to feel understood, which then improves their sentiment towards you because being understood feels good, and that increases their sense of openness towards you, which makes them more likely to listen back, which makes you feel better towards them, and you can potentially get a virtuous cycle going. And then lastly, relating to listening, I would define teaching as building a bridge between where someone is and where you want them to go. And if you're totally focused just on the where you want them to go, then you're not able to see where they are, and then you're not able to make that bridge, to state this in a very figurative way.
So that trick about repeating the question, I learned it at a very early age from a politician. That he was mostly saying this is also very useful because it gives you a chance to think through what you're gonna say, because for him it was usually then journalists asking. Now, we grew up together, and it was interesting because then I realized he's internalized it totally. So when you ask him, do you want to come out for a pizza? Do I want to have a pizza? It's somewhat endearing, but also somewhat ridiculous. But it is actually a useful thing. And it also trying to see if you can reconstruct where we're coming from and demonstrate it to them that you cared about that. I found that very, very powerful because it's so rare when people do that. Mm-hmm. People feel appreciated even if they're opposed to.
One thing I'll also add, I'm a little hesitant to say this because this starts to get a little bit into the manipulation place, but as another place for the repeating things back, is so only do this if it feels right. But one thing you can do with that is very subtly change what they said, or like in terms of what you focus on. But if it's like close enough to sound right, then and they agree to it, you've actually just kind of changed their mind a little bit right there.
Changing the framing, maybe?
Yes, it's in. I would question the hard distinction between those, but yes.
Yeah, I've noticed that that's actually quite useful, but like it's important to do it in a way where it feels like I'm actually adding more truth to it, so I'm like expanding on what they're already saying.
Yes, this slight reframing can be done for good purposes. I just want to flag it as something that can also be done for nefarious purposes, so use with caution. So going on from conversations a little bit, and also on the subject of like when things apply, a dynamic of conversation isn't a universal thing that you always use. There are certain situations that kind of pull in opposing directions. One of them is teaching, in which I'm referring to like lecturing to a large classroom or writing a blog or anything where you're like one person communicating to lots of people. And there's this essential trade-off, again, using Chris Crawford's words, of between efficiency and effectiveness. So efficiency is compressing a lot of information down, saying a lot in a small amount of space, and multiplying the number of listeners so that there's like less speaking needed to have the same effect. And yeah, this is great for accomplishing a lot in a short amount of time. However, when you're speaking to a lot of different people and when you're just communicating continuously, that takes away from the back and forth, which is necessary to have a Socratic dialogue, which is the most effective at actually changing any given individual's mind. So just noting a trade-off. And one characteristic of this, in the teaching mode, the flow of information is mostly one-directional, whereas in the conversational mode, it's two-directional. And I can imagine a objection here that teaching actually is two-dimensional. I'm using these as like extreme points on a continuum, so I'm maybe not using quite the right word. Another thing that pulls against conversation is debate. And this is specifically where the audience that matters is not the person you're speaking to. So if you're in a pub, like debating Jan LeCun in a monk debate, for example, or in a Twitter beef with lots of people watching it. In these kind of cases, the optimal strategy might be a little more performative. Things that might be terrible for interpersonal dynamics, such as dominating the other person or projecting like some kind of social status, can be very effective in a debate mode, and the worst thing you can do in a conversational mode. It'll push the other person away, but the audience might look at you more favorably, and so like there's a potential for disconnect there. So be aware of that in terms of like what sort of conversational modes you want to be in. Like if this debate framing sounds terrible, then don't go into those. Talk to people one-on-one. And then a third non-conversational medium is recruitment. So flyering to get people to show up to a protest the next day, networking at a large event, basically any context where there is more people to communicate with than you have time to speak to any of them. Because in that context, the optimal mode is often to just find the people who already agree and then recruit them rather than trying to make anyone agree or convince them. Because yeah, maybe you could have convinced that person who was like really skeptical, but in the time that you were talking to them, you could have spoken to 10 other people and gotten 3 people recruited for sure. So yeah, just another awareness of context. So assuming you're in a conversation and it's not one of these other modes, one of the first things is knowing your audience. And there's some elements of this that I imagine you're all familiar with, such as their background knowledge. If you assume too much background knowledge, then you might be saying things that's like a lot of jargon that they're not able to follow along and you lose them. But if you assume too little background knowledge and you explain literally everything, then that can come across as like a bit patronizing or boring. So getting that right. But I won't go into that a lot because that's something I think people are generally familiar with. One somewhat less familiar concept is what I call the agreement scale. I did not come up with this, but it's a 1 to 5 scale of where people agree or disagree. 1 is a strong disagree, 1 is strong disagree, 5 is strong agree, 3 is neutral. And generally a realistic goal in a conversation where your goal is to convert them, it's realistic to expect to move them 1 point along the scale. If they're at a 1 and you're hoping to get them to a 5 and like you're not going to be satisfied with anything else, that could happen, but you're kind of setting yourself up for frustration. So an implication of this is if you're talking to someone who like thinks you're crazy, your ideas is total nonsense, and at the end of the conversation, they disagree with you, but respect you. Like, okay, you're wrong, but I see how you could think that. That is what a win looks like in those conditions. So just kind of set that expectation. I think a lot of people tend to assume that you're taking them from like a 2 to a 4 or something, and that's not always the case. Then also, if you're talking to someone who's a 5, trying to convince them further, you're preaching to the choir, they don't really have anywhere to go. In that kind of context, the useful conversation tends to be more along the lines of activation, getting them from passively agreeing to actually doing something about it, if that's of interest to you. And last detail I'll mention here on terms of expectations, sometimes changes of mind don't happen until after the conversation's over. I know for myself that when I'm talking to a person, my mind's in a place of just taking a lot of information in. Processing it while there's a person looking at me is hard. And so what'll usually happen is I walk away, I'm on my own, then I can kind of relax, let any social anxiety fade, and then I'll process it and then change my mind. Not everyone's like that, but just something to be aware of. If you're getting stuck and frustrated, sometimes the magic is happening off stage. By the way, if anyone has a question or comment at some point, I don't want to get like sidetracked too much, but like little interjections are cool.
You have mostly been talking about interpersonal contacts and to some extent a bit of lectures and in some cases organizing. But I think there is another very important format coming from the kind of think tank side is of course figuring out who to talk to. You are strategic about your communication. Mm-hmm. That decision maker or the aides of that member of parliament, I really want to ending up next to them and giving them a few good ideas or making sure I get a meeting with them in the right context to spread some ideas. This is very different because now you're very strategic about how you communicate. It's not just that you're broadcasting or having it represented in different. And again, this is something that's very much on the strategic selling of ideas side. Mm-hmm. It's not at all about democratic thing. Oh yes, let's tell these important ideas so everybody wants to listen. But rather, okay, who can be useful for these ideas? So it's a very different mode, and it's very much more strategic. And one can of course try to fine tune it endlessly, or try to turn it into an art and just use charisma, or just go to an endless amount of cocktail parties and then bumping into people, which is very fun actually.
The thing I'm hearing there is the kind of meta question here of which conversations to have. Once you're in it, then a lot of these dynamics would still apply, but then like why are you talking to this person at this time? Yeah, no, that's a good view.
That mindset, again, one shouldn't necessarily go too far in it, because if everything is strategy, okay, you're not living your life, but it's quite useful to have some mental idea about, okay, where do I want to go with it? There are certain ideas that, okay, this is a good thing in this set of people, and no, this other idea, just tell everybody, it's a good thing for everybody to know.
I was going to add something to a thing you said earlier about the listening. I really agree with that. And to my mind, I coded as that they have a right to know that they've been understood. So not just that I'm inviting them to speak to me, right? Like you're setting up circumstances where you're inviting a conversation. I'm wanting to go to the point of that I'm basically saying, hey, not only are you speaking, but that I'm going to go through the effort to understand you. Like that it's my job to help you to communicate to me and to basically do my best to understand what you're saying. And then in addition to that, I have the additional burden to show them that I understood them. And so in effect, there's a sense in which if I'm doing that well, then there's a handshake, right? So it's like, in a sense, if we each do this for one another, then there's a kind of protocol handshake. So I don't, like if someone is seeking to understand what I'm saying and they show me that they've understood, then I don't feel the need to say that again because we've clearly got that and we can now build on that part of the conversation. So the conversation advances from, as you're saying, kind of maybe like a 1 to a 2, and then that's great. And we can start from some other future conversation after they had a chance to reflect and maybe move them from a 2 to a 3 and so on. But the notion here of how do I show them that I understood what they said? You mentioned this notion of repeat back, summary form of what they said. one technique that I found that is truly useful is to ask them a question that reveals to them the limits of my knowledge relative to what they were choosing to express. So in effect, it's like I'm showing them, rather than summarizing, because a robot can repeat something and can do a summarization. So at this point, I have to go farther. I have to basically ask something that, by the virtue of the fact that I knew to ask that, reveals to them the limits of my knowledge and therefore the volume of what I have comprehended. So in this particular sense, it advances that protocol handshake really well, and also invites a furthering of like the degree to which I understand them so they can be more fully expressed.
Yeah, now asking a relevant question, that is a deeper form of engagement than summarizing. More difficult, or when it's like really done well. But yes, no, that is a very good one. So moving on a little more on to other forms of knowing your audience. One element of this is just any core areas of disagreement on a logical level. And when I've seen this done well, it often has this look of this kind of speed chess moment, like early on in a conversation, where there's like some fairly quick backs and forths of just sort of categorizing what kind of conversation are we having here. And when you're in that phase, it can be useful to not just get super hung up on any particular detail. Diving into rabbit holes is great, but often it's good to know which rabbit holes to go into, like what are super relevant, and that means just kind of taking a survey of where they're at. And then the last thing I have here is implicit narratives. So if you start to notice that there are a lot of objections, but there's a certain pattern to them, or you see the person's seems like they're generating objections on the fly, this can point to that the actual objection is something a little deeper. And something that tends to be deeper is some narrative. So a couple examples that are specifically relevant to AI risk is big things don't happen. So like you're saying this, AI could destroy the world. Well, that's a really big thing. And the world doesn't really change that much, so that can't possibly happen because that's a big thing. Another one is relationships are zero sum. This is a very dangerous one, and I think is the basis for that constant refrain of the US has to accelerate at the maximum possible speed, otherwise we'll lose to China. There's a kind of an assumption here that there's a zero sum thing happening. Progress is good, progress is inevitable. These are all implicit narratives. And if those don't get addressed, you only address the things that come from them, then it's just gonna be like cutting off heads on a hydra. Just like new ones will just keep popping up because it's not really getting at the root, which is difficult because those root objections are often unstated. So to advice for dealing with those, I don't really have a really strong thing, but my best guess is really listening carefully and then asking questions to bring those implicit narratives to the surface. And it helps if you know the common ones in advance so that you can kind of see the telltale signs.
So I often encounter this when debating the ethics of human enhancement, because people immediately bring up a host of practical objections. I knock them down. Ethical objections, I knock them down. And I can keep on doing this endlessly, but I know that's never going to work because it's actually about the worldview. Typically, in the case of human enhancement, it's that people have an idea about the structure of the world having a moral meaning, and you're not allowed to touch that structure. And that is a tough one to deal with because it's an entire rich worldview. But recognizing that and trying to get there quickly actually allows you to do a lot of things well. Similarly, in the book we wrote, we realized that a lot of people in social science have a very strong implicit worldview that intentionality and agency only relates to humans. Other things cannot have this. It's absurd. It's a type error to attribute any agency to non-human entities, which means that AI safety is not a problem. We can only deal with the evil corporations being run by the billionaires. That is kind of where you end up with that view. You end up looking for the people, or maybe groups of people. Sociologists are fine with groups, but it's all derived from human intention. So when AI systems could have convergent goals, that's weird. So that's actually why we spend probably 200 pages, slowly moving the readers who don't know that we actually hold these views into a world of extended cognition, into various group entities, showing that, yeah, the knowledge is represented in markets, it's represented in the institutions and heuristics being shared. Oh, there's a lot of non-human agency going on here. And look, the software doesn't look that alien anymore.
Something I like there in terms of challenging a narrative is that it's often an intuition that's based on lots of little experiences that are then forgotten. And so providing contrary evidence or just showing data points that are not really objectionable, but kind of poke at that like underlying intuition. One thing I also mention here in those examples that you gave, some other alternative phrasings that might be cut a little deeper of some of those examples you gave. So with like AI not being dangerous because only true thinking happens in humans, another way you could say that is humans are special. How are we special? Because of how we think. And so then if you're saying, oh, machines can think, you're basically saying you're not special. And that could be a hard sell. Also, that other one about like human enhancement, there's also like something which I felt a little bit of a negative reaction like to that concept of human enhancement. And the thing that comes to my mind if I like look at the deepest level is essentially some form of Chesterton's fence of like, I don't know why people are the way they are, but we're really complicated systems, and messing with complex systems has weird unintended side effects. So I expect this to go wrong, even if I can't tell you how.
I have a paper about that. The evolution and challenge dilemma. We cannot give you half right.
Or just the notion God made us perfect, and so why should you fuck with that? Now, I don't meet with people who are like that very much, but I run into it from time to time.
And the interesting thing is, there are many people who believe that without believing in God.
Yeah.
Or they would not state it like that. You find a lot of people on the environmentalist side who are claiming to be totally naturalistic in their worldview, but actually believe nature has this moral structure. So there are different ways, and for example, your objection there, it's a valid one, and then you can start poking in where does evolution actually not provide it? Where is it clear that the fence? But even acknowledging that this is a reasonable thing to think, yeah, but that works.
I'm not against prosthetics. I'm against corporations overcharging me for prosthetics. like that's, I just don't want to be entangled with some other agency that essentially is now going to control my life through this device.
Yeah, but that's a very different one. Now we're talking about the implicit power games going on, and again, many people have these ideas about where power resides and how it works. Again, I had done so many enhancement ethics debates, so I know. Yeah, and then the inequality question ought to be coming any minute now. Oh, there it is. In some cases, that's kind of a relief. Sometimes you can even do interesting new stuff. But sadly, a lot of debates are also, once you've done them enough times, oh yes.
Actually, that raises a question for me. I think the point he's making and made earlier about power is actually really important to me, is that how are you factoring, like you're describing conversation as a kind of transactional thing, where each party is essentially benefiting the other by, engaging and sharing ideas. So there's a kind of care dimension to it, there's a kind of transaction dimension to it. You mentioned power in debates, to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that there's a sort of tacit sense in which power is showing up in conversations due to the underlying narratives, like there's a kind of competing narrative sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to figure out how to navigate that, and Ramalt and I think
I feel that really strongly.
Both run into this a lot. Like people are set like, no, we have to do this, and there's such an emotional drive behind that it warps the conversational dynamic. And I guess,
particularly in a group setting, that makes it even worse, because then you have everyone in that group kind of seemingly, like maybe I'm also like too afraid that that's going to happen. Like I have to be careful.
There's egos involved, and there's reputation, and there's status involved. It's like I can't be wrong because I'll look bad to all my students, or any number of political variations of that. So I guess to some extent is, in your experience, how do you navigate the power dimensions of the conversation?
So when they have a basically incentive to believe what they're believing, but that incentive is essentially a social reputational kind of thing. Yeah, that's a hard one, and one I didn't really have a strong preparation for. But essentially, I guess the same basic idea which I would apply to lots of things, which is helping bring that out and seeing like ways that can be worked with it. So, you know, if they can't really publicly espouse some certain belief because there's like they would get rejected otherwise. Are there forms of the thing that you're talking about that are more acceptable? Is this something they can believe in private? If this need to be accepted by this group is really part of a more fundamental need that to just be accepted by any group, maybe a good starting point would rather be like to not talk about the issue at all and just introduce them to different friends.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing to mind, and I appreciate the vulnerability of the answer, just basically saying, yeah, actually this is hard. And what I'm hearing inside your answer is something that actually comes up in a number of the conversations that we're having on a philosophical level, which is to say, yeah, I want to honor the other person's dignity, safety, and belongingness. If I'm threatening their dignity, if I'm threatening their sense of belongingness, or I'm making the conversation in some way unsafe for them, or that they believe that it's creating unsafety or a loss of dignity or a loss of belongingness, that they are going to have some reaction. So I have to track that somehow.
Yeah, basically that's it. Is the underlying issue is that yes, something about what you're talking about is making them unsafe or feel unsafe, and so dealing with that sense of safety, either by bringing it up and navigating it, or by giving that in some other way, or just not engaging in that conversation.
Can we extend to say something like political conversations or ones where there's an issue of safety, dignity, or belongingness at stake?
Yeah, I think that's a useful definition and framing.
That's new information.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks for adding that.
It just became a question in this conversation. Yeah. It's like, oh, this is a really neat way to think about politics. And you know, frankly, I'm learning something right now, which is like, yeah, actually, these are really important issues. And frankly, as part of community building, like I think a lot about community building outside of existential risk. It's like, how do we choose to become more skillful about how we create dignity, safety, and belongingness for one another?
Yeah, and that actually points to a partial answer to that is like maybe that moment where you're talking to the person like isn't the right time to try to convince them of anything, but what's really needed is to create alternative communities where what people are incentivized to think functions differently, possibly is more open, or maybe it pushes a different direction, and like that's really where the point of intervention is. Yeah.
Like what I hear your presentation as being like a little bit about is how do we build the skill of how we communicate with one another?
Yes.
And so in that sense, I'm like, yeah, I'm like all for this. Like I think that's a fantastic way to think about it. And moreover than that, it dovetails very nicely with like, if we're doing better sense making, or we're doing a sense in which we're like actually trying to figure out some really hard stuff, which has emotional implications, has safety implications, obviously, but also dignity and belongingness aspects. And we need to treat these together to be able to do this conversation well. Otherwise, we're just creating out groups and, you know, we're the right ones and they're the wrong ones, and all of a sudden there's all this division. But frankly, that's just an absence of skill in how we're conveying it.
That's beautiful. I love that.
So, I have a question, kind of alongside that. There's kind of this implicit power dynamic that exists when you're bringing somebody what is effectively a problem as opposed to a solution. Because there are certain people that are very solution driven, and if you just bring them a problem, or even worse, if you bring them a statement as we're doing that there is no solution to this problem that they have, in a way you can interpret that as a power dynamic. And I find those conversations to be excessively difficult.
I don't quite follow the connection between having a problem without necessarily a solution to someone who wants to find solutions with power.
It's from the interpretation of what a conversation actually is.
Okay.
So you're imposing this deceit assumption on them that basically I can have a conversation with you alerting you that this is a problem. And
then they shoot the messenger because you're basically bringing them bad news.
Yeah, okay, so I'm glad somebody understood kind of what I was getting at.
You know what's really ironic about it is I actually encounter the opposite situation just as often.
You say, likewise.
Yeah, okay. But say we're in some sort of conversation. I will tend to sort of point to situations where people are wanting to relate on a more emotional level. And if I basically bring a solution to that situation, and the other person wants to relate emotionally, and I'm not trying to get into sexual dynamics very much, but it tends to occur more often, they will reject the proposal. And so now there's this sort of power contest going on where I'm basically, like, say there's a real need to solve a problem. It's like, okay, I'll give you a basic example. Which restaurant are we gonna go to, okay? Like, we both wanna eat. So I'll say, how about we go here? No. How about we go here? No. How about we go here? And the thing is that if you're being vulnerable in the sense of creating solutions into a space, and the only thing the other person has to do is to reject the proposal, how long is it going to be before you're going to feel like there's a power asymmetry, that you're putting in a lot of effort to create proposals into a solution space only to have those shot down by another person without them putting in at least equal effort to come up with a counter proposal or an amendment to the proposal that actually works. So in this sense, there's a power asymmetry because it's just genuinely harder to think of solutions to hard problems, and way very easy to basically say, no, that won't work because of some trivial reason.
Yeah, that is an excellent summary of what I was getting at. This is like I almost consider this a second derivative level of thinking in terms of conversations, but I've personally encountered it a lot, especially when conveying ideas like that, which is why I felt it was worthwhile to bring up.
So I track this dimension, and so in effect what happens is that it's like, because of the trauma history, I notice this very quickly. Like, and there's a sense in which I'm saying, okay,
it makes sense.
I'm tracking the degree to which they have a willingness to seek to understand, and a willingness to actually seek to solve the problem. And if there's a sense in which they're moving into, we're going to be in some sort of contest, rather than we're going to, in a sense, understand one another so that we can turn and then look together into the world to try to gain insight what's going on. And I'm basically saying, oh, we're in a conflict-oriented conversation where the game is to win versus a sense-making conversation where the game is to have insight and solve a problem. And so in effect, I'm like, my first thing is, where is the other person? Can I discern where they are in this moment? Are they wanting to win, or are they needing to basically try to figure out something?
I'm still trying to understand like what's going on here. Like for some reason I want to.
I think I want to try to repeat back my understanding of the thing that you were bringing up. I think Forrest's response to it is excellent, and I'll probably just agree with that. But just making sure I get this, it's essentially like if you're coming at a place where you're wanting to present a problem, and the other person wants to present a solution, in a lot of ways your job is easier because just mentioning problems is fundamentally easier than coming up with solutions to complex problems.
It is emotionally harder.
Emotionally harder, but like logically easier. And so maybe it kind of gives you a...
There's a lot of nuance. It's not easy.
I mean, summarily, you're definitely in the ballpark. There is a lot of nuance to this. It can be perceived as a lack of empathy, I think, on one person's part, because like an example in context to what we're working on is suppose we go to somebody working at Anthropic and we're like, hey, we think you need to stop working on AI, right? Mm-hmm. They are not in a position, if they are working at Anthropic, where they can just do that. They have their own livelihood. They have their own maybe investors, and they want to keep their like nice house. So they would see that as us basically being very unempathetic towards their current situation.
Got it. Yeah, so this actually touches on one of the things that I was going to speak to next, which was on the subject of like, if you start seeing, someone's probably not going to just say that directly, because if they did, then you could address it and just provide some empathy to it and say like, this is a truth-seeking conversation, not trying to win points. But most often that's just going to come out in the form of like weird objections, things that just don't really hold up or make sense or constantly get replaced when you knock them down.
Their ego, their entire sense of identity is defined in terms of the work that they've chosen to do. So as a sense, it becomes an attack on their dignity immediately. And so now there's a sense of, well, how do I bridge the gap so that's not the thing that's going on?
Yeah, and unfortunately there are some things there are some massive problems you can't tiptoe around, so it becomes this, well, I want to communicate this in a way that doesn't attack their life work.
Yeah, so for someone like me with a trauma background coming into this, you have to understand that I'm literally standing at the very place that is the least attractive place that I could possibly land in the entire universe of ideas and discourse.
Yeah, actually that's kind of a response, but the one framing I had for a kind of a similar idea to what you're bringing up is what I call buffer reasoning, where a form of it is I don't like the solution that this problem implies, and so I'm going to dismiss the problem because thinking about that solution, I really just don't want to. So I'm going to stay as far away from it as possible and just reject things that kind of approach it. And
I heard that a lot.
yeah. So yeah, an example of that, calling this out is if AI risk as a problem implies a solution of stopping or shutting down AI, but then you can go further than that. Like, so stopping AI is a big enough thing if you're like working at Anthropic. But even for a regular person who's like doesn't have a vested interest, well, what would it take to have a coordinated shutdown of a technology when there's like international race dynamics? That kind of sounds like it implies world government. I'm like not going to mince words on that. Like now maybe there's some clever way around it involving like distributed something blockchain, but like. But like those aren't battle tested the way government is, and like the concept of centralizing power that much is genuinely scary. So like that's a good case for buffer reasoning.
Kind of say that, like, to me that seems an example of possibly a way that AI safety, for like Nick Bostrom with the vulnerable world hypothesis, and maybe like some people around PauseAI stuff have kind of worked themselves in a corner. The question really is like, does that imply the other thing? Like, I mean, yeah, like it really seems like a question, like, because you're kind of implying that that's the only choice that we could make or the only thing we could do. But really is like centralizing decision-making and control, like an authority, the only way of dealing with the problem. And maybe the issue is that we've kind of turned ourselves into that kind of win-lose kind of framing. Like, we have to do this thing even though everyone loses out because we'll set up a global dictatorship.
See, at that point, I'd be looking for an underlying narrative. Are human beings smart enough to make choices? I mean, part of the reason that sometimes people want this super intelligent AI is because they're saying humans are too stupid to do that. We should make AI do it for us. I'm basically like, no, I need to challenge that underlying narrative. Humans are actually pretty good at making choices. They just don't know it because they're fighting with one another all the time.
And the problem with the vulnerable world hypothesis paper is that Nick is kind of making a philosophical argument, and he's being, unfortunately, totally a philosopher about it instead of doing practical political philosophy. So it's even in the journal Global Policy, which is kind of about policy rather than philosophy, but it's probably a philosophy paper. So he's throwing out a few options, and then he's kind of done his job and goes home. And he never realized that actually you probably need to do more in this space. But he was basically saying, yeah, but I'm leaving that to people who understand politics. But he's getting totally misunderstood by even his friends. And it's really annoying because I don't feel like I need to defend the paper. It's rather, okay, you just left us here with this argument that is going to mislead a lot of people. Because this dynamics is super common. You see it, for example, that, okay, the environmentalists aligned with the political left. So the political right in the most Western countries decided that environmental stuff is generally a bad leftist thing, we should be against it, so you get weird pathologies about that. Even though environmentalists started out as an arch-conservative movement, back then it was actually the socialists who felt like, no, we should cut down the forest to give to the people.
So let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Are you saying that he wasn't arguing for panopticon-type dynamics?
No.
Because I read his paper
it's an
as
example.
essentially a setup for that.
Yeah, no, it's an example. This is one possible solution.
But you know him personally, so that's why, like, when I read that paper, I was like, holy shit, this guy thinks this is the answer.
Yeah.
And he set this whole paper up to come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
Everything else was kind of incidental, and he was really pointing for that. And I'm like, damn, that's like, I can't go there. Like, what the hell?
And this is the problem. He doesn't really believe it. I think
it's terribly written.
Yeah.
You're just going to say, I misunderstood it, and I'm trying to.
Yeah. But this is the problem when you don't even get that other people will read the paper in a weird way. And Nick doesn't even go out and try to rectify misunderstandings about his papers, which is another stupid thing. So, you can spend your time endlessly correcting stupidity because there is an infinite amount. But you need to sometimes clarify something.
See, I actually backed away from trying to communicate with him.
Yeah.
because of these kinds of issues.
Yeah, one of my most controversial papers was about the reason I wrote it was basically to show environmental ethics and the medical ethics about enhancement don't mesh at all. This is an interesting philosophical challenge. So it was a paper about dealing with climate change by modifying humans genetically. It's my most controversial paper, and it's interesting because I actually found that, okay, obviously my libertarian friends hated it, even though we kind of set it up that, oh yes, this is all about voluntary stuff. They knew governments will want to impose this. And the environmentalists, of course, hated it because this is a silly thing. Bill McKibben said that this was the most stupid climate fix ever, and that warms my heart. But what I never really thought about was that climate denialists are often bioconservatives instead. So we were pressing two big red buttons, so they hated all the paper really well. But the cool thing was, when it hit the presses, I also had managed to do a rather good interview with The Guardian, and wrote an FAQ explaining a few things, including the fact that just because we're making this argument doesn't mean we think this is the best thing ever. This is why we're doing it. We could actually explain it. We had to explain it a bunch of times. It's also very well cited. It was good for my career because an endless number of papers arguing it's a stupid paper. And I'm getting citations for every one of them. But there you could actually engage. I think it's sometimes very important to make it clear what you stand for. And I think some people who don't like engaging too much, they should probably ally with somebody who likes engaging.
I feel like there is this kind of, when people kind of react really strongly, say like you're implying this, I used to kind of maybe more ignore it. Now I kind of take it more seriously. Like with the vulnerable world hypothesis, my question still would be, why did Bostrom go for that? Yeah. Like as I know it sounds like he wants kind of taken it as like a philosophical kind of hypothesis or like something to go with, but why pick that over other things? So there's a question about motivations there, like why explore this area so that
I think this is a true and relevant thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think unfortunately he doesn't quite get how other people take it. Or maybe he doesn't care enough about it, but I also think it's super annoying because it's a kind of central paper, but it's also doing a disservice to the conversation. So sometimes one should be rather careful about how you frame your question. And that is of course an interesting problem. So he didn't even recognize that this was a spicy take.
Huh.
And that is a little bit of a trick, of course, because I think most normal people would realize, wait a minute. But he didn't ask around. And, well, in our conversations in the philosophy seminar room, of course, nobody really said that's a spicy take, because a typical Oxford seminar, spicy takes are kind of a currency. You want to try to see if I can get some of the numbers.
He's not safe to talk to again.
Sorry?
I said, now you just reconvinced me that he's not safe to talk to.
I think he's intellectually getting stuff, but he doesn't quite get the rhetorics. And I think the globus, ethos, and pathos again.
A minimum threshold. I'm basically saying, unless the person is at least this tall emotional maturity, I'm not even entering the conversation.
For interest of time, I want to bring this back towards the end. And I liked something Rimmelt said earlier in terms of like that points to a solution to this issue of buffer reasoning, which is essentially like finding and empathizing with the epicenter of it. Whether you're owning a spicy take or just saying avoiding it by saying, hey, maybe AI doesn't require world governance, maybe there's some other way, but like calling that out so that you can redirect it, so you can own it, or just say like, yeah, this is hard and there's a trade-off, or like however you want to go about it, but just like taking that from implicit to explicit and then doing something from there. What that something looks like is going to be very context dependent. Going a little more quickly on some other weird sources of weird objections. You know, there's your standard heuristics and biases, which imagine you're familiar with. Your standard motivated reasoning and bad faith. But another one that's a little less known is forgotten sources and details. So they have a belief that's formed over time. There's a lot of intuitions behind it. They've forgotten what a lot of those are. Now you're challenging the belief and they're wanting to defend it because you haven't dealt with all those intuitions, but they've forgotten them so they can't say it. And that's a really frustrating place to be. And they're ultimately frustrated with themselves at not being able to articulate what's going on in their mind. But if there's not awareness of the self-frustration, it could get taken out on you. So one potential solution, if that's what's going on, is this practice of steel manning, where you help them make their point more reasonable so that it can be refuted. And then lastly, another one is, which has kind of come up already, but I'll put a name on it, is unseen adversaries of X or someone else hurt me, you sound like them, so therefore I don't trust you. And for this, it's kind of engaging with them as an individual, building up your ethos, your personal connection so that they can trust you. And if this is done well, but they don't really get the generalized lesson, this could come out in the form of, oh, I still don't like that group you're a part of, but you're different. And that's kind of a partial win. And maybe if you build on that, that'll become, oh, you're one of the good ones. So there's categories and you're in that. And then if you keep building on that, then they're actually engaging with it more deeply. Then that's something to work on. And then the last point here on weird objections is if you find yourself getting frustrated in the conversation, it's probably best to just cut your losses and walk away. Not every conversation is winnable, and also people are probably going to pick up on your frustration, and that's going to be a source of defensiveness that could make things worse. Don't try to solve every single thing. Last notes is just summing up some things on human connection. There's a really good quote from my grandpa-in-law that told me when I was a teenager, when someone is 90% wrong, that means they're 10% right, and you got to give them that 10%. This relates to actually a more general point that I say about feedback, like if you're reviewing a job that someone's done. There's that idea that it's never really felt of the compliment sandwich that's always felt a little insincere. A different version of that same idea is if you think of the path to enlightenment or understanding as this path, they're going to be somewhere on it. They're not going to be at the very beginning. They're not going to be at the very end. They're somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's at 1%. Maybe it's at 90%. And so wherever they are, it's always going to be possible to give them credit for the 3 steps before they are, and then guidance for the 1 step ahead. And so that's the kind of how you can have a balance of positive and negative. Just find where they are, give them kudos for whatever they've done, whether that's a little bit or a lot, and then when you've established that, go a little bit further. One reason that this, on the subject of listening, why this can be so powerful, I found one of the most effective persuasion techniques actually doesn't involve speaking at all. If you can get someone's internal monologue to be something to the effect of, wait, you understand me, and yet you still disagree. I must have missed something. Because how can you know what I'm thinking and then not disagree with it anyway? There's got to be something else going on. And what that leads to is that when someone starts looking for ways that you could be right, rather than ways you could be wrong, that's the moment where you win. And I'll end it with there, and any closing discussion, we may be over time, so that's the end of it.
How do you have the good faith that a person will do that? I literally, on Monday, the day before coming to this conference, had a conversation where I demonstrated to them that I understood completely, had them agree with that. And because I didn't agree with them anyways, they doubled down on the egoic. And I was like, what the heck? That's a place where I'm at that point I was just confused. Because they kept insisting that I agree with them. And I was like, I just don't.
So I'm describing a tendency, and people are unique individuals, so none of this is going to work 100% of the time. Occasionally you just have to accept okay, this didn't go the way I mostly would have liked it to, and there's not anything I can do about it.
I think of something that I've noticed, maybe as something that in the conversation I try to have, that maybe was a problem, is there's a bunch of reasons why I don't really like Elias Sikowski's work, but there's something that I did like is that he wrote this post about what was it called again? Having there is this kind of ancient kind of Chinese kind of book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, is kind of leaving room to escape. There's a particular term.
Leaving an exit?
Leaving an exit, leaving some kind of escape route. And think about that in terms of if the way I'm kind of trying to explain this thing is basically implying like, okay, you suck, your reasoning sucks. This implies that like what the work you've been doing sucks and like has no value to the world, and it basically implies that you're going to be helpless because you can't use what you've been doing, and like we're all stuffed and like we can all just feel helpless together and we're gonna die together, you know, like that's just like, you know, like it's just like, yeah, what am I expecting of people when I'm doing that? And like that is something like leaving an escape route. Like there's a question like, or maybe another way, like leaving kind of a route to kind of grow with this new understanding
I think
in mind.
You just answered the question I asked him.
Yeah, if that's what was going on, so like the way I would frame that is, if the thing that's blocking the other person is a need to save face, and admitting that they were wrong is like damaging to their ego, and that is the thing that's stopping them, then that leaving an escape route and having some way of taking on your idea without saying that you're right, without saying I'm wrong. And if you can give them some way to do that, then that deals with that specific problem. So like, I wasn't present to that conversation. If that's what was going on in the person's mind, then okay.
Prevented them from having an escape route. I was intentional about it. And that's why I was saying when you answered that question, it was like all of a sudden it made it clear, because to some extent, the implications of their argument was existential. I didn't have permission. I didn't feel ethically that I was willing to give them an escape route. I basically wanted them pinned.
But like, I also noticed like that there's something that I can actually kind of relate with particularly in the AI safety community, that if the consequence of kind of them kind of taking, like at least like how people feel about it initially is like, that implies I've lost all autonomy or any kind of sense that I can still do something about this problem. That's a pretty big ask. Like someone who's like focused so much, like kind of build up all of these tool sets and ways.
This is back to what Richard was mentioning. I mean, we find ourselves in this situation uncomfortably often.
Well, actually, something that Will said brought up a notion for me that was really interesting, and it's mostly like a question to actually everybody here, which is, was there ever a time when anyone sitting in this room was actually really hopeful about AI? It was like,
oh, sure.
Yeah, so
I still have my PhD essay, like why I'm trying to get on the PhD program. Like, yeah, we'll build this utopia. It's going to be so awesome. I'll help humanity.
Yeah, so that brought up for me was like, oh, I remember thinking like, sweet, AI sounds amazing, and actually, so then the next kind of notion that came up for me is that like, this is actually a journey that we have all been on as well. So like, just the empathizing with the individual, that I've been on the same journey as them, and then just actually kind of like recognizing how hard that process was for myself, and just kind of like the notion of the transformation from feeling excited about AI to like losing sleep over it, to like feeling depressed about it, to like, and just having some degree of reflection about that transformation, and reflection around what were the tools that I needed at the time in order to cope with it, and find my way to a sense of like humor and peace, and like you said, like agency is just a line of thinking that something Will said kind of inspired in me, because sometimes I forget that, oh yeah, like I actually went through that as well. Like
So you're basically saying that we're a refugee camp? And if so, how do we invite people in a refugee camp that doesn't feel like a downgrade?
Yeah, there's something about, okay, just the awareness that if you really hold on to the truth of the situation, there is, like, your world is going to end in a sense, and that's a big ask for anybody. Like, it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily die, but you might feel like you're going to die, and now you have to hold the existential threat of all life. I mean, it's a big ask, and it's just there's a degree of delicacy that I think is possible to hold if one holds in mind the actual journey and experience that oneself went through, to be able to get to a place where you're like, all right, I still want to live, and I still want to do something about it. So, you know.
So it might help to explain that we are scientists and engineers. We love technology. We want AI as a tool. We just don't want certain systems to be too powerful without control. I love AI. I use it all the time.
I like the compassion of this and your response, and I think that that's actually an answer to the question that we're exploring, and I feel responded to in that sense. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, like it's we're not actually so different. Like, you know, like there's a deep love of technology, a deep love of the powers that it has, like a genuine, like natural excitement towards these things, and also kind of a sad trough that you got to get through to recalibrate these like new expectations about what it can and can't be, and there's something out there.
And it's also that you kind of have to grow up, not just emotional, but also in the way of thinking about the technology. That might be an ongoing process that might take a lot of weird twists and turns. After all, I started out in the 90s on Extropia's list as a gung-ho transhumanist. I'm still a transhumanist. I'm still thinking AI is probably going to be really good, except that I have enough PDU to say, uh-oh, we better get this to work. And that puts me in a really odd position, because I'm kind of exuberantly optimistic about the future and dreading it at the same time. And it's also possible to dread the positive futures, because that's a lot of transformation. And in many ways, disasters are easier to deal with than, oh no, I might have to deal with a lot of really weird stuff. And it's interesting because you also over time discover that you change side a few times. And that is something most people don't want to admit that they do, but they should. The people who never change sides, they're totally nuts. I remember reading Nick Bostrom's original existential risk paper on the train to New Haven for a transhumanist conference, and I hated the paper. This is Luddite propaganda. This is going to be used to slow down these wonderful, beautiful technology that we believe in. Why did Nick write this? And over the years, I realized actually it's got a few good points, really important points actually. I came around to that, but then I typically had to explain to journalists that actually the reason we're researching X-rays is that we're optimistic about the future. If we felt the future was going to be crap, why care about existential risk? That might end the suffering. But we think the future could be awesome, and that is why we need to save it. And also we are optimistic about our agency, that we could do something about it.
Yeah.
And then you get to update this. And sometimes you realize that it gets very awkward to cite some of your earlier writings, but yeah, that's life.
Yeah. So there's like several things. There's like the camp switching, the awkwardness, the edge of growth. But there's also the kind of like appropriate carrot stick experience, which is like sometimes it's not about showing someone how wrong they are. It's about and like hitting them with the stick. You're thinking about this the wrong way, as much as it is, hey, there's an even cooler thing over here that's happening. That's like safe.
And sometimes it gets awkward also because your old friends don't make the same switching as you do. I have real trouble with some of my old transhumanist friends who are now raving accelerationists, mostly because we're middle-aged transhumanists and really want that life extension coming very quickly. Let's hope the AI gets it. And I just tell them, yeah, I want life extension too. That's why I want safe superintelligence rather than unsafe superintelligence, because that is not going to be good for your life extension.
The thing that really in this sort of bifurcation, I noticed that one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. And frankly, that seems to be true universally across the board for every version of utopia there is. I noticed that it's very easy to convert a utopia into a dystopia. It's not at all easy to convert dystopias into utopias. In other words, that the class of utopias is strictly smaller than the class of dystopias. And when I basically say, okay, I noticed that this is going on, that there's multiple utopias, and that at least for everyone else, that utopia is their dystopia. So therefore, I want to have no preference as to the style of the utopia. But I do notice that in every conception of utopia that exists, that there is a common property. And that common property turns out to be some notion of wisdom, i.e. that the culture that created that utopia, however that came about, had the wisdom to basically become healthy, had the wisdom to effectively become integrated, or to have solved the problems that are so pressing to us today, but not just those, but every variation of all of the problems that could even be conceived of, to the point that some genuine notion of integral health had actually been arrived at. So I gave up the notion of looking for utopia or even being enthusiastic about technology in any particular manifestation, and actually looked at what are the conditions necessary to create wisdom in humanity. And that's like that is a complete transformation of effort. And so in effect, it's a little bit like even being at this conference and talking about artificial intelligence is actually considerably less interesting to me than what are the conditions by which we can actually create wisdom in humanity? How can we ourselves in this room create a level of wisdom adequate enough to convey these positions to people who genuinely probably care about this stuff at least as well as we do? And to orient from that perspective adequately well so that we don't get hung up on this version of utopia or that version of utopia.
And so I think this is a good segue to, I think the wise thing to do now is take a break.
There's one closing comment I'll have, and then go off of that. This is kind of addressing that question of how you deal with being a really bearer of bad news. And one analogy I have here is that if you look at the plot storytelling, like of a movie or book, and this is something Kurt Vonnegut came up with, of like the y-axis is the protagonist's happiness, and the x-axis is time. A lot of stories follow the path of start like moderately high, then there's this big valley, and then it ends up a little bit higher than it was at the start. And there's a variation of it where there's a little bump and then it goes down and like that. And so being able to show someone, show them that path exists, and once they have that faith, then they can accept the trough before they come back up again. And in terms of what that might look like, okay, where things go low, we all know that. But how does it get back towards hopefulness and better than even when you started? And ultimately, if we think about what it would take to have a safe future from AI, whether you think that's alignment or stopping AI or whatever else, any answer involves, like what Forrest said, some degree of societal wisdom. And if we think about what the world would be like if there was a dramatic increase in wisdom, that sounds pretty awesome. I can't say exactly what it looks like, but it not only deals with AI, but probably deals with a lot of other things as well. And so that's the kind of hopeful ending sort of take. And if you can communicate that, then that allows for a lot of potential acceptance.
Yeah, maybe the conversation isn't super intelligence, but super wisdom. That's what we need for, and how do we distinguish?
With that, happy to.
So thanks so much for the session.